This is Enjoy It While It Lasts, and I'm your host, Herman Faust. Today's chill, My Life as a Reader, Goosebumps to the Cosmere. I'm going to talk to you about what reading has meant to me at different stages in my life, how it's helped shape who I am, the way I think, and the things that I do. Reading has always come in many forms for me and has filled many purposes in my life. It's been fun, rewarding, challenging at times, and always evolving. Anyway, chill with me and I'll talk to you about it. I started reading for fun as a little kid. So much so that it became a thing for my grandma to keep a box of the little golden books for me in her bedroom. And she would read to me to try to help me whenever I didn't want to take a nap. Another book that I remember from her house that I ended up reading a lot at the time as a kid and loving it was But No Elephants, about a little old lady that keeps buying pets from a pet salesman that makes her house more and more chaotic, but they all end up being able to fix each other's problems and live together. But there was also just a ton of the typical fairy tales that you would see in a kid's collection, including lots of books from Disney movies. Like I remember a Beauty and the Beast book that basically followed the movie. It was definitely something that I would go to. I would get lost in the books for what felt like hours at the time. Besides reading kids' books together and reading on my own, my ama also got me into reading the newspaper. From the time I was about 7 years old, she would let me take the funnies right away, all the comic strips, and I would read through those pretty much habitually. And that the next step of that for me was starting to take the sports section, and I would go through and read mainly football articles at the time, but whatever caught my attention was what was in the sports section. Besides having regular kids books for me and getting me into the newspaper, my mama also got me into puzzle books. She used to love the word searches, and I started by doing those with her. She would get me my own book to do it alongside of her. And then that evolved into her getting me more different types of puzzle books, and eventually getting the highlights subscription. For anyone that doesn't remember highlights or never had highlights, the magazine, it was basically a lot of word puzzles or logic puzzles or hidden pictures, find the differences, all those kinds of things. And also mixed in with like a few little short stories or interesting facts that was always something that as soon as we got it, I would spend however much time it took for me to basically go through the entire book. I would make sure that I did every single page, every single puzzle. I'd read all of the whatever information it was giving me, and 99% of the time I found what it was telling me intriguing, or the puzzles to be challenging enough to keep me entertained. The few times where it didn't do those things, I still, because of the nature of how I am, I still ended up finding myself fighting through it and completing the pages that I didn't want to do. But again, it was rare that there were pages that I didn't want to do. I think my favorite was the logic puzzles, where you'd have to have the table of information and you'd be figuring out who did what at what time or whatever the setup would be. But yeah, that was what reading looked like for me early on in my life. So even in the beginning of me reading, it was already shaping up to be a multi-format purpose for me, a multi-use tool. However, each form of reading did have its own safety attached to it for me, as it was all one way or another a shared time, a connected time for me. It allowed me a different way to bond deeper with my grandmother while also just opening my mind in different ways. So reading always brought me comfort. To go along with the puzzle books, I remember one of my first longer books that I read was actually something that made me feel like I was playing a game and not just reading a book. It was a Super Mario Choose Your Own Adventure book, and it was something that I became obsessed with basically. It was so cool to me to feel like I was being fully immersed in a world that I had grew up playing, on a Nintendo system, and you kind of fill in the gaps of your in your imagination of what is and isn't in the world of what these characters are actually like when they interact with each other. So that part by itself was very just mind blowing to me to feel like we're getting an in depth look into the world and at the characters. Then, of course, what really pulled me in was the fact that I felt like I was controlling the book. I remember like the very first choice you could pick is if you wanted to play as Mario or Luigi. And then from there, it just kept on being just decision after decision as you read a few pages at a time and would be told where to turn the page to go according to whatever decision you make. Just like with a Mario game on a Nintendo system, I read through that book and tried to play through it in different ways and find all of what I consider to be the secret levels, also while trying to avoid losing any lives in the meantime. But eventually, I ended up just trying to read through the story and find the entire decision tree, find the entire every single outcome, every single possibility of experience you could have by reading the book. Another big thing for me at that age was I remember getting introduced to Greek mythology monsters. There was a kids version of a monsters book that basically was like an index of all the different types of monsters and little facts about them. That was also the main type of reading I did back then, as I got a little bit older, past the little kids book. I tended to be drawn towards books that were either short stories or felt like they were informational, I guess, without being overly complex. The first chapter books that I started to get into was the Goosebumps series. These were the first books that I started to read that actually had its own longer narrative, besides just the typical kids' books that you would read all in one setting. I wish I could tell you what the first Goosebumps book I read was, but honestly, I don't remember because once I started, I pretty much dove headfirst into the series and would check out every single Goosebumps book I could get my hands on from the school library. I would buy them anytime I had a chance, whether it be a school book fair or just out at a store. If we saw a book that I had not read before, if I had any extra money, or if not, I would try to convince my mom to get it for me. So I'm pretty sure that eventually I ended up reading, uh, if not all, most of the Goosebumps books that were published. It was something that I basically was doing at all times. I always had a Goosebumps book that I was reading. And I even remember the first time that I read a whole book in one day, and that felt like such a huge marker for me. That one I do remember. It was about the Beast in the East. Excuse me, the Beast from the East. I remember that book It wasn't because I liked that book any better than any other ones. It just happened to be a day where I started reading it a little bit early in the day, and I got so entranced with it, I guess, and didn't have anything else stopping me or anything else to do that day, to where I made it through by the some point in the afternoon. But of course, I ended up watching the show when the show Goosebumps came out. It was I got the Pogs whenever the Pogs came out. I It was something that it was a really big identity marker for me. That's how much I loved Goosebumps as a, I don't know, little second or third grader, however old I was at the time. I do remember it was big for me when I discovered the Goosebumps version of a Choose Your Own Adventure book, the Choose Your Own Scare books. Um, I Just like all the other ones, I would read those as well. I would always, similar to with the Mario, I would start off trying to survive the book. I would try to the make the decisions that I thought would lead me to the good ending. I think the book Welcome to Camp Jelly Jam, if that's the one it was, if that's what the title is, right, was the only book that I can remember on my first read through making it all the way through the story and surviving and feeling good about it. Most of the time, you usually would stumble your way and make a wrong decision and end up dead or just cursed one way or the another. Um, but after I did my initial read and at my what I would consider my pure attempt at trying to beat the book, I would also do the same thing that I did with that Super Mario book, and I would exhaust every single decision tree, and find every branch of the story possible to see just what all could happen. I think at some point in reading Goosebumps, I shifted from preferring the choose your own scares, preferring the reading a book as if it was a game, to at some point preferring the narratives, just kind of wanting to know, okay, what I felt like, what actually happened in this world. Not what am I making happen, but what does the creator of this world, what does the author intend for this story? That started to be what I cared more about. At some point, with my mom realizing how much I enjoyed reading horror stories, she let me start sampling some of her Stephen King books. She would let me read with her as long as I was, sitting next to her at the time and was actively reading, so that she wouldn't have to be waiting forever for me to turn the page. Um, and so I took in scenes or chapters at a time of different Stephen King stories. At that point, never read any cover to cover, never read a full story, but I would just kind of get a feel for them, read enough to know that it definitely intrigued me and that I liked what I was reading. I liked the stories of them. She did introduce me to a book of short stories of Stephen King, and I did end up reading those all the way. I like those a lot. I think that I forget what the name of it was, but I know that one of the short stories in that book was the one where a man fights a bunch of toy soldiers, and they become like they're shooting real ammunition at him, real tiny ammunition at him, and it's a whole thing. But there were several other of his short stories in that book that I read as well. So this was a natural evolution for me of my love of horror writing just developing and maturing a little bit. I also started to find a love of comedy. I would read Mad Magazine. That was the first comedy writing that I got into. But then also there was like a book of a person that like wrote letters to different companies, making ridiculous requests to hotels or brand requests, and he would include his letters and whatever letters the companies wrote back to him. Um, Also, I remember just getting into like different Simpsons books or old timey joke books that were probably not probably they were definitely inappropriate for me to read at the time, but I just loved reading little things that would be little bursts of funny to me. Shortly after that, sometime in middle school, is when you get start getting introduced to different moral novels, moral lesson novels. I don't know what to call what you'd want to call them, but the one that stands out for me, a lot of people read it in middle school, is To Kill a Mockingbird. That was the first story that I read that really resonated with me, not because of plot or because of the overall story of what was happening, but the little pieces of the stories all put together. The intimacy of finding Boo's hideout in the tree and all of the stuff that he would leave there. The character reveal of starting with Boo thinking that he's some monster, and then as you slowly learn that he's just a person, of course, seeing the unfairness and unjustness of society at the time and feeling angered by that. The emotional aspect of seeing the dog need to get shot down because it's rabid, and how tense that scene was without ever actually doing anything as dramatic as, say, Cujo did, whenever if I'm comparing it to the other types of books that I would read. But from there, I started reading other young adult and more real world novels, what would feel like real slice of life stories, I guess. Um, I know one that was popular for a lot of people that was one that I also liked a lot and reread a lot was Go Ask Alice, the story of how a young girl basically slowly becomes addicted to drugs through her perspective. And I had one more other book that I reread a couple of times that stuck with me a lot back then that had a similar theme. It was called That Was Then, This Is Now. That one was also pretty heavy-handed attempt at trying to make sure you knew the risk of drugs, but the story was about these two foster brothers who were kind of street kids, I guess you could say. They hustled at pool, they got into bar fights together, and they just tried to make it together. One of them ended up selling drugs, the other one had issues with it, and that caused problems with them. There was a side story where a character, a side character ended up taking LSD and ended up like permanently having issues because of it. Um, I remember at the time thinking, well, first how it did make it seem like these were a realistic depiction, at least in my head at that age, made it feel like, oh, I could really understand how somebody could actually fall into this path of whether it be drug abuse or overuse in a one-time thing, or chronic abuse, or even how they could turn to selling as a way to help get out of their situation. And it made it feel like the characters were real people. I remember also though feeling like it was very over the top in its messaging. I didn't really have the word for it, but I felt like I was being fed propaganda, anti-drug propaganda. Even though in my head I felt that I agreed with the messaging of, hey, we shouldn't do drugs, it just felt like they were really trying to pound it in your head. But even though I felt that way at the time, I still liked those books so much because I connected with the characters. I felt like I was fully emotionally invested in these characters. So I it cared a lot about what happened to them. The sadness of those books is probably what made it stick with me so much at the time and made me reread them as well, and why they still feel important to me even now. The sadness was not a detriment to the books, in my opinion. It made me like them more because it made me. I was just discovering how important being able to have actual emotion evoked from reading or taking in a story really meant, how powerful that made the story. Even as a teen in high school, reading never stopped being a big part of my life. It Maybe slowed down a little bit because I had just a normal teenage social life. I was in, I played sports. I tried to do a lot of hood rat things with my friends all the time, but I always still enjoyed reading and generally speaking had a book that I was working on. And at one point for an assignment in high school, I had to read The Pit and the Pendulum. That short story was a big turning point for me because I ended up trying my best to get my hands on every single Edgar Allan Poe book that I could. I'd read all of his. I read all of his short stories that I could. To this day, I still think The Raven is the most hauntingly beautiful poem that I've ever read and is by far my favorite poem. And if you're not sure how important he was to me as an author, the very first name that I had got my wife to agree to was whenever we're talking about potentially naming our kids, before we had any ever, just the ongoing conversation that we had as a couple, is that I convinced her that we would be using Poe as a middle name for our child, and that's probably what I was going to end up calling that kid, despite whatever their first name was. And sure enough, our youngest daughter, Esmeralda Poe, and pretty much goes by Poe most of the time. Also in high school, I discovered, or I guess I should say, I cemented my love of Greek mythology. I remember reading for my first AP English course a book of brought me back to my younger days because it was a book of short stories, but they were all of the different Greek myths and all about the Greek gods. And it fully immersed me into the world and made me feel like I was learning every single story, that every single character at least in the world, but it was still digestible for a 14-year-old. The If I had to pick one single most impactful story that I read in high school, though, it wouldn't be a Greek mythology, but it would be one to do with monsters. It would be Beowulf. I fell in love. I fell in love from the first time that I read Beowulf, and it stayed important to me throughout my life. I love the portrayal of him as a um, true hero, an actual hero, but also showing his flaws and also showing as a man that exaggerates his strengths, as a person that pretends like he has no fear and is just portrays himself as invincible when clearly he doesn't believe that himself. So it gave me both like the feeling, the badass hero feeling, but also at the same time the very real like human vulnerability and self-doubt and facing his mistakes of his own bad choices and facing down having to face the truth of his own lies and propaganda. But because he's Beowulf, still ended up coming across as the ultimate hero, despite all of that. High school was also the start of me reading sports articles online. This was the first real dip my toe in the water of taking in news by reading it online, even though it was pretty much just sports at that time. But something that was more impactful on my life and my reading journey from when I was a teenager was my newfound obsession with urban legends and finding an online community website that I felt was perfect because it had this master list of urban legends, and it was a place where users could submit different stories, whether they're submitting their own legends, their local legends, or their own fictional short stories. They had different writing contests that I would enter. And I remember every single contest I entered, I was always in like the top two or three of the final winners. And I remember winning it once and feeling like that was just a really big achievement for me, and for me because it felt like strangers are telling me that my writing was good. This also was right around the same time that I had a high school teacher tell me that my writing reminded him of Eminem and Stephen King. So you put that together, and 15, 16-year-old me just felt like I had made it. I was on top of the world. I was surely destined to be the next great horror novelist. When I got to college, reading became way more intense and purposeful for me, which, of course, is not something that is unique to me. It is a time where you have a lot more demand on what you need to read. I was a philosophy major and an English minor. So, besides meaning that I have no real career path to follow, it also meant that I had a ton of reading and very different types of reading to do while I was in college. I'm going to talk about the philosophical side first. Whenever I first took an intro to philosophy class, I wasn't quite sure what I was getting into. I took it because it sounded a little bit more interesting than psychology, and I had to pick one. And I ended up falling in love with philosophy very quickly. We only ended up having one main book to read. Like, it was an intro to philosophy book that was our main reading. We had some articles that were assigned to us every now and then throughout the semester. But that book, those articles, and mainly my professor's teaching style combined to really shape not just my love of philosophy, but shape the way that I thought. It helped me really put together a full cognitive process and not just have emotions lead my opinions. It made me really figure out how to question myself and see what I really believed and what I didn't believe. I actually still keep in touch with that first professor, and I've told her that she is probably the biggest person or the biggest influence on how I operate, how I think, and how I see the world of any other teacher that I've had in my life. The reading that I fell in love with in philosophy was a few different kinds. I loved the thought experiments, the um, also the written conversations that you would read between two philosophers, the dialogues that would build upon each itself and crescendo into making a point. Um, I also loved the way that it helped me shape my own writing, how it made me tighten my logic and make sure that I didn't have any holes in my logic whenever I was trying to make a point. Um, the thought experiments, though, is something that I still love to this day. I love creating scenarios and thinking through all of the moral and logistical implications of every decision that you can make. It's a way of using imagination to interpret your real feelings and real beliefs on the real world, which in a way is also what any good fictional story will do for you as well. But the thought experiments were more purposeful in doing so, and would definitely try to lean. You could try to change them in a way that you felt was both fair with the scenario. You had to make it both fair with the scenario, but also have a analogous to whatever real world point you were trying to make. So it also challenged like your creativity at the same time as it challenged your logical thinking. On the English side, I discovered Russian literature in college, like authors like Kafka and Dostoevsky. It kind of introduced me to absurdism as well as absurd realism, both as its own kind of unique subgenre. Separately from that, I remember it was in college whenever I read what was one of my wife's favorite books at the time, The Sea Wolf. It was part of me wanting to, one, find another book to read, because like I said, I always had a book going, but also trying to bond with her because it was something that she loved and I wanted to be a part of it. Um, I remember a scene from that book that stuck with me. The lesson of it, the moral of it, has stuck with me till this day. It was whenever there was a battle between the ship that our main character was on and another pirate ship. And the main character was on the deck with the captain. And as they were talking, the main character claimed that while he was obviously terrified and the captain was fearless in the moment, the main character was showing more bravery than the captain because of that fear. He made the argument that you can't really show bravery if you don't have any fear to begin with. The whole point of being brave is to overcome your fear and still do whatever it is you need to do. So the Sea Wolf is a story that I do love, but it also mainly is sticks with me just for that moment by itself. I also got introduced into uh, what would be, I guess, my second phase of having a favorite author, which was Steinbeck. When I got into from Of Mice and Men, of the Pearl, and to Grapes of Wrath, to East of Eden, um, I started to really enjoy these stories that functioned as moral tales more than just narratives. And also, each one of those books definitely has different scenes or aspects of it that will just stick with you. At least they've stuck with me. Whether it be the feeling of hopelessness that can come along with some of these books, or the frustration with the system that can lead to the suffering that we see, or even just moments of levity. I think the biggest inside joke in my marriage that came from these books is from East of Eden, or sorry, from Grapes of Wrath, when there was a character that got picked up by it was during this the book, in case you don't know, is set like during the Great Depression, and it's about a family migrating to California to try to find work, and along the way they pick up another couple that was stranded on the road, on the side of the road, and kept having issue after issue. And in a moment of like pure devastation, the character was apologetic for things that were completely out of her control, but she's telling our main characters, the family, that we ain't been nothing but trouble, nothing but trouble. And while in the story, it's a moment of both like just sadness of how a character can be forced to feel like a burden when nothing they've done is, or nothing that's happening is their fault, but the idea of a person just feeling like they ain't been nothing but trouble. Me and my wife say that anytime that there's something going on, that something that ain't nothing but trouble, ain't nothing but trouble. Oh, I do want to mention, since this is about just different aspects of my reading life, I did have two different times where I tried reading Lord of the Rings. I started it in high school once, and again at some point in college. I love the movies, like pretty much everybody, and like most readers, you know what, like every reader, I'll agree that most books, almost every single book, is way better than whatever movie is made out of it. Um, but when it comes to Lord of the Rings, I just could never get myself into it. I felt like it was so extremely overly detailed in the world building, and that made it drag and led to it being extremely boring for me, that I never could get myself to finish it. I mean, I felt like I was an inch into the book, and it still was not even close to them being out of the Shire yet. That was the sign for me in high school. In college, I was able to I got a little through it a little bit more, but I felt like I was just forcing myself to read it. So eventually, I stopped into. I will say, in my adulthood, a couple years ago, I did go back and I read it. I read it. I got through the entire series, and I at least enjoyed it a little bit. But I still stand by that the books themselves are just very, very anticlimactic. They'll spend an hour describing what the differences between this forest and the previous forest they were in, but when it's time for a battle scene, it just simply says that Aragorn fought his way through the crowd and then kind of ends the battle scenes pretty quickly. It doesn't pay off on the excitement, and more than that, I don't think that the book actually makes the characters likable that much. It doesn't make you feel that much for them, at least. The movies did a way better job at making you care about the characters as people than the books did. Um, I respect the work, of course. It's what started. I know what many people will say is what started the whole genre of fantasy. So I respect it. I get the importance of it. But for me, I just could never, and still never really got into or found the love of the books of Lord of the Rings. Even when I graduated, though, reading never stopped for me. It was always a huge part of my life. I went through a phase of trying to explore every single classic that I could get my hands on. Whenever I was working as a teacher assistant, I was always reading whenever I had possible. Like whenever the kids were out like in their specials, whether it be art or music or PE or whatever, and I had my break, I would be reading during that time. I would be reading. If there was testing that I could get away with it, I would still choose to read at home at times. So reading was still a very big part of my life throughout my 20s. At that point, it was pretty much all entertainment for me, though. I still read newspapers, some. I read news articles, some. But I mainly took in my news from TV watching at this point, for news watching at this point, and turned away from reading the news as much, and turned my reading pretty much, like I said, all for entertainment purposes. Whether it be trying to get any classic or just any highly recommended fictional book that I could get my hands on, or into continuing like from my Mad Magazine childhood into cracked articles as an adult, and just kind of reading different fun facts or fun slanted articles. It wasn't until I was about 29 years old whenever I had to had my first real break with reading, and that wasn't really a choice about the reading. It was more a choice about time, because that's whenever I became a father. That's whenever we started to have our kids come foster to adopt and eventually adopt in our house. And pretty much all of my reading for several years at that point was reading to them, reading just kids' books, never having the energy or the time to read whatever I wanted on my own. Not literally never. It didn't 100% go away, but it basically went away. I'd say maybe 95% of the way reading went away for me. I will say, at least luckily for me, I had already kind of liked reading some kids' books. I got introduced to reading some kids' books by me working in education and being an early child educator. I was introduced to Mo Williams books like that, and also anywhere from that Mo Williams books, I mean, to Dr. Seuss, to up to like Harry Potter or different teen or young adult books that I would read as in my mid 20s to later 20s. I guess the last phase I was in before I took my break in reading was in catching up in books that I probably should have read as a preteen instead of the Stephen King books I was reading at the time. So reading to my kids, it wasn't like I'm reading books that were suddenly foreign to me. I was also used to reading to kids, so I'm used to reading with the voices and making it a performance of it. But like I said, it just became that was what reading was for me. It wasn't for me anymore. At some point, I tried to pick up reading again and let reading be for me again. Um, but I had trouble. For the first time in my life, it was very hard for me to sit down and read. I couldn't focus on what I was reading and would end up rereading pages over and over again and eventually get very frustrated with the process and stop reading at all. I have since been diagnosed with ADHD, and that has made a lot of things make sense for my life, including starting in my childhood. But one thing it didn't really make sense for me was this reading struggle, at least not at first, because even though I can agree with the diagnosis that I have ADHD, it didn't make sense to me that why am I now not able to focus on reading when for the first almost 3 decades of my life, it was such a huge part of my life. As I learned a little bit more through therapy, though, it made a little bit more sense that while ADHD was always present, it wasn't always, I guess, being presenting the same way because I didn't have the same types of demand on my attention or the same type of stressors being put on me in my younger adult life or child life when I was reading. By the time I'm in my 30s trying to read as a father, I have spent years of being um, being able to never really focus on one thing at a time, of always having my attention split, of always being on demand, and got completely out of practice of ever just sitting and focusing on one thing at a time. Also, just the weight of responsibility and the work that goes into being an adult contributes to taking away your mental bandwidth in a way that you may not think about, because I know I didn't think about it, that it kind of exasperates ADHD symptoms. And that's kind of why reading became a problem for me, even though it wasn't in the past. And it was a problem. It was a problem that I tried intentionally to work on. I brought up with my therapist. I focused on it with myself in different ways. And I never, at least as of now, still have never really made progress into being able to sit down and read words on the page anymore. It's very difficult for me. I have, however, found audiobooks to be a solution and a way for me to still enjoy reading and be able to take it in. That allows me to still have access to the same stories that I used to have, just in a different form. Now, instead of sitting down and reading with my eyes, I tend to read with my ears whenever I'm doing just some mindless task, whether I'm cooking, cleaning, going on a walk, driving somewhere. I'm able to read during those times. Like I said, read with my ears. And I can put myself in the place mentally that I used to be able to put myself into by looking at the words, now by listening to the words, and am able to follow along 100% and picture everything just like I used to be able to, just by taking it in a different way now. This started with I got introduced to audiobooks as a thing for me by going on road trips with my wife. Every now and then we would find something to listen to that wasn't a podcast or wasn't music. We would, pick out a book. If we had a long trip, we would pick out a book that we would try to get through during that trip. And yeah, that was my introduction to it. Although it didn't really stick to a thing that I did on my own for a while. It kind of trickled into my life as a thing that I would do. It didn't become fully re-immersed in my life until about, or I should say, reintegrated in my life until a little bit over a year ago, when I had a friend invite me to a book club. I ended up going to, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 of the book club meetings. I really enjoyed going and talking about the books, but the meetings themselves were really were secondary. The main goal of it and the role it played for me, and it succeeded in that goal, was making reading a habit for me again, making it something that I always had a book that I was working on. It got me just kind of back into the routine of reading, and once I've got back into it, I've got back into reading pretty hard. The same friend that invited me to the book club also got me started on a Court of Thorns and Roses. So I read through that series. I got myself fully immersed in fairy smut. I've started Fourth Wing. I read a few books of the Fourth Wing series, and I'm planning on going. I know there's one or maybe even two more series by Sarah J. Maas that I'm gonna have to get into, and she's definitely has a list of all the different fairy smut books that I need to add to my collection of what I've read as I continue to go on this new chapter of my journey. The biggest thing that I've gotten into, though, since I've started rereading, is Brandon Sanderson and his the Cosmere. If you're not sure, if you don't know what that is, that's what he calls like the universe that a lot of his stories take place in. It's the Cosmere. It started with me reading I've read the Mistborn trilogy, the first Mistborn trilogy, I should say, and the Stormlight Archive. Everything that's out right now, which is 5 incredibly long books, and apparently those incredibly long books only take up the first half of his Stormlight Archive series. Um, I've read all 8 of those books pretty much like all back to back since I started. I started with the first Way of Kings book, and then I just kind of went back and forth between those two series, which are in the same universe. And I have now basically found the universe that feels like something that little me would have never imagined would ever be a thing that exists, that would have such detail and power in specific scenes, while also being such a over the top large, bigger than any single character, just epic among epics. um, and for everything to still connect and fit, and for you to care about every single character that's written, and for everything that happens, you can see has a cause of it happening, and also will have an effect on later events. It's it's a lot. It's a lot. I wouldn't recommend it to somebody that is not fully aware of what they're getting into. But if you like that type of reading, it's maybe the best fictional universe that I've ever been a part of as a fan. I am needing and have started to take a little bit of a break from the Cosmere, and just so I can cross some other of the books off my list that I have been accumulating. I gotta have a couple of easy reads to give me a little bit of a break and palate cleanser before I start going back and filling in all of the gaps and reading all the other stories of in Brandon Sanderson's universe that I haven't gotten to yet. Either way, I am just happy that reading has become a big part of my life again. And I'm hopeful now that with audiobooks being fully integrated in my life, that I will not ever have to have another gap of reading leaving me. And I am also still hopeful that at some point I'll be able to find the attention span and the brain bandwidth to be able to sit down and read a novel with my eyes again as well. Nothing I obviously have nothing against audiobooks. I just talked about how they've brought reading back to me, but I would like to be able to read in both ways moving forward, if I can ever get myself there. I do want to let you know that I will be planning to do some episodes of a book club style. I already know the first book that will happen in this series will be The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. For now, though, thank you guys for chilling with me. I'm gonna go try to read a little bit more right now, actually. Remember, you only got one life to live. You might as well enjoy it while it lasts.